Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Joe Brady, and I'm here to talk today about getting it right in the camera. We're going to focus today on landscape photography. Now, as I mentioned, today's subject is getting the best landscape image possible right at capture. When you do this, your image edits can be focused on enhancing and shaping your image rather than trying to do emergency first aid to get your images back. Now, landscape photography has its own particular sets of challenges and rewards. Understanding and evaluating the light in a scene is going to go a long way towards helping you produce the best image possible. And like all photography, it's all about the light. In fact, to quote Ansel Adams, landscape photography is the supreme test of the photographer and often the supreme disappointment. So, to keep that disappointment from happening and achieve the goal of getting the best image possible right at capture, here's the kind of things I'd like to talk about today. First, evaluating the scene. What is it you see when you first get there, and how are you going to approach it? Secondly, ambient light metering. You'd think it's something your camera can do well, but we're going to see that's not really the case. Third, protecting the highlights. One of the absolute most important things to do with digital photography, particularly with landscapes. I'm also going to discuss the concept of shooting to the right. This has to do with getting your data over towards the right edge of the histogram so that you have the best possible data in your file. And then lastly, compensating for filters. What happens if you're going to use a neutral density filter, a circular polarizer? What is that going to do to your metering? So let's start with some questions that you might consider when you arrive at a location. First of all, what is attracted to you to the scene? What is it that really speaks to you? What is the light doing? Are the shadows really extra deep? Are there highlights you have to be worried about? How is your lens selection going to affect the image? Do you need a very deep depth of field? Do you have foreground elements and distant elements that need to be in focus? Or is there some distant element that's really important that you need to bring a little bit closer? What do you hope to share with the viewer? That's probably one of the biggest points. Why are you taking the image? That's really it. Why are you taking this photograph? What do you want to share with your viewers? As you look through the viewfinder, try to conceive what the finished image will look like. This is a great time to eliminate distractions and unnecessary elements that might detract from your photo. Take a look around the edges of your camera's viewfinder and be aware of things that can detract from your image. Now, sometimes it's as simple as just squatting down, moving left to right, or sitting on the ground. A slightly adjusted point of view can make an enormous difference in a photo. Now, last week we did a photo and video shoot in some nearby spots to illustrate these points. We're going to start off by taking a look at our first morning shoot and the conditions we encountered. Now, as I said earlier, while we're watching this, take advantage of the chat room to ask questions. And when we come back live on the set, we'll discuss some of them. So let's visit a great view of the Bear Mountain Bridge from Fort Montgomery State Park in Orange County, New York.
One of the things I like to do when I first get to a place is evaluate it. But I know sometimes you get to somewhere really exciting, you've never been there before, it's just really beautiful, you can't wait to shoot. So my recommendation to you is, go ahead, get it out of your system, just start shooting. Forget about everything else, shoot it, get it out of your system. Then after that's done, then calm down and evaluate the scene. So we're at a spot that I have been before. This is Hudson River over to this side, along with the Bear Mountain Bridge. And it's a really pretty sight. The light is not great this morning. We had beautiful clouds yesterday, but they all disappeared. So we're going to deal with it. Now we've got also a very extreme tonal range. So I have to think about the light, I've got to think about the composition, and I have to think about, do I want a single shot or do I want to plan for a panoramic, and am I going to have to expose accordingly? So I figured out how I want to compose the shot. I've got some beautiful branches overhanging here. I've got the Bear Mountain Bridge underneath those. I've got some nice rocks, some fallen logs here along the water. So I want to frame that all into a nice shot. Now the problem is, well, why do I need a meter? Why can't I just use my camera? Why can't I put it on matrix evaluative metering and let it do its thing? Well, let's go ahead and take a look and see what happens. Because as I do this, if I put my camera on program mode and it's on evaluative metering, I'm at 160 ISO, by the way. Now, as I frame the shot, if I frame dead center, I'm getting a reading of 500th of a second at f11. Lovely. However, when I reframe, just over to the left, just a little bit, so that I'm now getting more of the mountain in the scene, it went down to 200th of a second at 7.1. And as I come over even further, Let's see what happens. If I go to the other side, I'm getting 1/60th of a second at 5.6. How can you possibly figure out the correct exposure if that's what your camera is telling me? I need to know what's going to be the best exposure for that scene. Ooh, there's one little puffy white cloud that just showed up. I'm going to see if I can get him in the frame. So what I need to do is I need to use a meter. I need to find out what the ambient light is first. And I'm going to start out very simply. I've got a Sekonic 308S here. And yes, the bridge is, I don't know, a mile over that direction, maybe half a mile. But the same sun is hitting it that's hitting here. I just want to make sure I'm in the same light. The bridge is not in shade. I am, so I need to get out in the sun. So I come right here, and I'm getting 250th of a second at f13. So let's give that a try. So I just put my camera on manual, 250 at f13, and I can frame and take my shot. I'm just going to get these branches where I want them. And lovely. Now, that was an ambient average scene. Now, some of the stuff off in the distance is dark, so I may want to adjust for that. This did give me a good exposure, but it may make my shadows a little bit deep. So this is a case, since I've got a real bright background, where I'm going to want to do something called shooting to the right. I want to put that really bright highlight. You can see that really bright sky at the horizon. That's almost white. So what I need to do is I'm going to just use my camera to do it first. I'm going to put my camera on spot metering, and I'm going to meter for that particular spot. And keeping my f13, that reading there gives me a shutter speed of 640th of a second. Now, that's if I wanted to put that bright spot in the middle. I don't want to put it in the middle, I want to put it towards the right. Now, I know that my camera can capture safely up and down at least 2.5 stops from that middle reading. I'm going to play it safe, and I'm going to take that reading that I just got, that 640 at f13, and I'm going to open up 2 stops from that. That'll push that reading way to the right, but give me plenty of wiggle room to keep it from overexposing. Now, how do I do that? It's a lot to figure out. Well, my camera is set in 3rd stop increments, so I can adjust either shutter speed or f-stop. Now, since I've got these foreground elements here, I do want to try to keep those in focus, so I want to keep my f13. I'm just going to adjust my shutter speed so that I open up 2 stops. And since the camera's in 3rd stops, I don't have to think about it. I just know that each click is 1/3 of a stop. So as I bring my shutter speed, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 6 gives me 2 exact stops. I can now see that f13 at 1/60th of a second is 2 stops open from that highlight reading. That'll push the highlight to the right and give me the best exposure for this scene. So let's try that. Let's change my framing a little bit. And that gives me a nice exposure. That's really what I'm after.
All right, just a couple of questions came through while we were watching that, and actually some of them I'm not going to answer right now because there's subjects coming up. But for example, somebody asked about how do you make changes in the camera for a filter on the lens. Stay tuned, we're going to talk about that. Someone else asked about using a light meter for the zone system. A big discussion in its own, but when we're talking about taking an ambient light reading, for those of you that don't know the zone system, don't worry about it right now. But when we take that ambient reading, basically what we're doing is we're starting with putting the ambient reading at 5. It depends on where you're going to have your printing done as well. You may want to go to 6. The shooting to the right is also applicable to the zone system. When we come back after the next video, I'm actually going to show you guys a book. If you're really into the zone system and metering, I'll show you a book you want to get. Now someone asked about when do I use the spot meter, and the spot meter is going to get used when I need to measure that brightest highlight, and we're going to see that used because that's a really important part of protecting the highlights. And then lastly, someone asked where did I point the dome when measuring the light for the bridge shot. Well, since the only light I have is the sun, with the dome up, I simply hold it in front of me and take a reading. It's really that simple. I don't need to point it back to the camera or out at the bridge because I'm measuring the light falling on me. Doesn't matter that the bridge is a mile away. The sun's 96 million miles away, so it doesn't matter if there's a mile of difference between us. The mile isn't going to matter. I just want to make sure I'm under the same type of light. I don't want to be under the shade if my bridge is in the bright sun. But it's really as simple as I just hold it out in front of me like that and take my reading. But good questions, thank you for that. Now, while all rules are meant to sometimes be broken, there are a handful of guidelines that will help you create images that have balance, harmony, and more staying power. So let's talk a little bit about subject placement. This may be basic to many of you, but no discussion about composition should be talked about without bringing up the old rule of thirds. In photography, yes, those rules are meant to be broken, but it helps to understand how this basic concept works. Simply put, the idea is to think about your image divided into thirds, and the place where these lines intersect are the strongest visual points. So let's take a look. Let's actually bring up an image with a grid over top of it. So there were two basic benefits of using the rule of thirds grid in a landscape. The first is subject placement, the second is the horizon placement. Now, you don't need to slavishly adhere to putting the focus point of the image exactly on one of these intersections, but getting it close will help. And if we take a look here, we can see that the horizon is very close to the bottom third line, so we have that 1/3 to 2/3 of horizon to sky. We've got our clump of trees on the right-hand side intersecting two of those strong points. And in addition, we also have the dark leaves overhanging and the final tree on the right-hand side that actually has the effect of keeping you from leaving the image. Now, concerning subject placement, while not always necessary, if you try to put a dominant subject at one of the rule of thirds intersections, use the one on the right. Why? Well, there's a couple of reasons that this works. First of all, we read images like we read a book from left to right, so we're going to track the image from left to right and get to our subject. Secondly, if you have those dark elements on the right-hand side, it has the effect of keeping you there. Last Sunday, I was on a photo walk with my friend Rick Salmon, and we went to the Unisphere. Now, those of you that aren't local might not know what the Unisphere is. It's actually this giant globe that's in a park in Flushing Meadow, New York. It's actually in between the U.S. Tennis Center, where the U.S. Open takes place, and Citi Field, where the Mets play. If none of those mean anything to you either, at the end of Men in Black, the first one, it's the thing the spaceship crashes through. So let's take a look first. Here's a beautiful sunset. We've got the Unisphere on the left here. Now, it's a nice image, and you look at the Unisphere first. But as you track to the right, you've just got open sky, and there's nothing keeping you there. Now, this same scene framed just a little bit differently, where we put the Unisphere on the right-hand side, and now you're tracking left to the right. You've got a little light post that stops you for a second, then you head to the Unisphere, and since it's got dark object, it keeps you from leaving the image and brings you back in a little bit. Now, in this case, I thought there could have been a little bit more room off to the right, so what I actually did when I was composing this shot was I was planning for a panoramic. I wanted to extend off a little bit, so this is actually those two shots composited. Now, in general, when you're dealing with landscapes or environmental portraits with a horizon line, it's best to keep the ratio of sky to foreground, that kind of 1/3, 2/3. Decide if you want your horizon at the bottom third or the top third. You need to decide what's more important, the sky or the foreground. Horizons placed in the center of an image, unless there's a real reason for maybe reflection reasons, have a tendency to look very static. Now, one more comment about subject placement. Placing the subject on the left can also work, but the image will be stronger if there is some right side element that keeps you from leaving the image. In fact, actually, I'm going to show you my laptop screen. I've got an image up here, actually the image we were just seeing with the rule of thirds grid, and I'm going to bring a grid up over top of it. Now, here you see the thin grid. Oh, by the way, in Photoshop, there is not a default rule of thirds grid that you can just keep up all the time. There is one when you go to crop. If you want to create your own, just go under Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices, and set your grid to every 34% and pick a color. I like the bright green because it shows up easily. So we can see here, let me just get rid of some of the other elements here. So you can see, again, we've got the horizon gently sloping up along the bottom third. We've got a dark mass of trees that keep you from leaving the image. And we've got our clump of trees, that is the subject in this case, on the right-hand side. Now, just to compare, let's take a look and see what happens if we were actually to flip this image horizontally. And you can see, I'll get rid of the grid, you can see the image loses a little bit because now you've got this sloping horizon taking you out of the image and there's nothing to stop you. So you can see as I flip back that the image works better there. Now, I also mentioned about putting the subject on the left-hand side, and you can do this as well. Now let's add an element to this image. I'm going to put this on the lower left side, and I'm sure this is something you've all seen. So let me add this layer. And it's of course a giant strawberry with a cow hiding behind it. Now I did this for a couple of reasons. One, to put an image on the left or a subject on the left you could see. And secondly, to put something warm, to put that red strawberry there. Your eye automatically goes to warm colors. It actually projects closer to you. And it actually adds a little more dimension to the image because the cooler colors like blue recede. Now we've also still got, let me get rid of the menus a second. We've also still got this grouping of trees off to the right that keep you from leaving the image. So yeah, I actually kind of like that. I think I might print this one out and put it on my wall. All right, let's get back to reality here. So once again, there are exceptions to using the rule of thirds, particularly when you're dealing with reflections or very symmetrical features. But in general, give it a try because it will frequently work. And again, if the sky is the most important feature, also remember to leave yourself enough foreground to give your image a base. If you just have a little slither of foreground, it's just not going to be enough. If your landscape has a cloudless sky, on the other hand, try minimizing the sky or bring in some foreground elements to add some framing like we did with the bridge where we had some of the trees overhanging. Now let's talk a little bit about exposure and ambient light metering. Now you might think exposure is easy. I mean, your camera takes care of all that, doesn't it? Well, in some cases, yes. But in many cases, the correct answer is not quite. And in some cases, the answer is a plain no. Yes, it's true today that imaging editing programs can do amazing things and help to fix bad exposures and a little too much tonal range. However, in almost every case, those edits are going to result in damage to the image. This is particularly noticeable in shadow areas. Even a half a stop under exposure can degrade an image by adding some kind of nasty noise in there. So this is why I rely on a handheld meter for the vast majority of my photography. So let's go back to Fort Montgomery and compare the in-camera meter to the results we get with a handheld meter. While there, I'm also going to shoot a 5-image stitch panoramic that I'm actually going to do by hand. Not technically the best way to do it, but it can actually work, so take a look.
Now, this is a spot that kind of cries out for doing a panoramic. And yes, I've got a tripod with me, and I'll show you that a little later. But I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to do a handheld stitch. Now remember, we already found out our perfect exposure. I don't want to change that. If you're going to do a panoramic, make sure you find your exposure and stick with it. So what I'm going to do is just get my framing in the middle, and then I'm going to pan left and right. Now, I've got some foreground elements here, and I want to make sure that they kind of stitch together. Ideally, again, later I'll use my tripod for this. I want to rotate the camera along this point, not along the back. If I do it this way, I'm going to have trouble lining up my foreground elements. If I rotate here, which I happen to know is closer to the nodal point, if I do this, I'm going to get a much better stitch. So I'm going to frame again. This is actually a very nice shot. And rotate on my finger. And then I'm going to go the other way a couple. And that's going to be a really interesting stitch. It's going to give us a nice panorama of the scene. You might have noticed that I shot vertically. That allowed me to include a lot more of the foreground elements, have the trees hanging over in this kind of open bit of sky. It's going to make for a really nice panoramic. Now also composition-wise, make sure you don't put your subject dead center. That's really boring. I want to make sure that I have the right span of the bridge kind of towards the right of the frame. And I'm also going to frame this one a little bit differently. I've got some interesting stuff going on here. And I want to keep this in focus. So I need to check one other thing. I'm going to bring out my phone. You might wonder what I could possibly use my phone for. Well, one of my favorite apps is on here. It's a free app. It's called Field Tools Depth of Field Guide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check my focal length I'm using. This is a 17 to 55 millimeter 2.8 lens, by the way. And I'm going to actually shoot at 17 because it just works for this scene. So let me just tell it my lens. All right, so I put in my focal length, which is 17. My aperture is f13. And my distance to my subject is way far. It says 275 feet is the biggest number. But with that number set in, this application tells me that everything from 3.9 feet to infinity will be in focus. 4 feet out is my framing. Now, do I want to get a little closer? let me see if I come up to f16. If I go up to f16, that makes it from 3 feet to infinity is in focus. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to adjust to f16, which is 2/3 of a stop. So I'm going to adjust my shutter speed 2/3 of a stop the other direction. So now I'm at 100th of a second at f16. So I'm going to actually focus about halfway out here. And now I'm going to frame this mud in the foreground. So this will be in focus and then all the way back to the bridge. Now, way back when, we used to have these markings on our lenses that told us what was in focus based on the aperture. Now, you need an app to do it. But once you get the hang of this, you kind of start to learn what your camera can do, and it really makes it easy. So, just to sum up what we've done, I used a really basic meter, the Sekonic 308. I love this meter. It's light and it's small. It's going to give me a great reading because, like all handheld light meters, it's measuring the light falling on the scene. It doesn't care what color or shadow depth the thing you're photographing is. By doing it this way, I know the light falling on the scene. It's not going to be influenced by the color of stuff off in the distance, and it's going to be a consistent, perfect exposure.
All right, couple of really good questions. So let's explore these because getting into some of the nitty-gritty here. Now, someone mentioned that they're trying to use the ambient meter in full sun, and when the lumisphere has the sun striking it, the readings get ruined. Yeah, if it's the middle of the day, that can happen. This first shoot we were doing was about 9:30 in the morning. So if that's the case, and I have seen that happen, I generally try to avoid shooting in the middle of the day. But if you've got a bright sun hitting this lumisphere, then what I will do in that case is I will put the lumisphere right on the edge of a shadow that I'm casting. So I'll have a little bit of shade, it'll be right on the edge, and that will give me a correct meter reading for the sunlit scene without having the meter completely blow out because it's getting direct sun hitting on it. So good question, good point. Fine technique that usually is more applicable during the middle of the day. 11:30 to 2, say, which is generally a time I would avoid shooting landscapes. But if you have to, yes, put the meter right on the fringe of a shade of a shadow, usually cast by myself, and that should eliminate that. But really good question. Thank you for that. A couple other questions that came up interesting. Someone asked, why am I shooting at 160 ISO rather than 100 or 200 ISO? That's because I'm a Canon shooter, and the Canon 7Ds and 5Ds actually have a base ISO of 160. Going down to 100 actually doesn't gain you anything. So the actual base ISOs of the Canon that are going to give you the best result are 160, 320, 640, etc. Nikons are different. I believe Nikons are either 100 or 200 ISO is the base for, depending on which camera. So for you Nikon folks, it's going to be the even numbers. For you Canon folks, 160 and multiples of that. Now someone says they have a 358. There's a 358 right here. And someone asked whether to extend the sensor. I assume you mean the sphere. Generally for landscape shooting, you're always going to have the sphere out. The whole idea of bringing the sphere in is to be able to measure directional light. And that's something we do in the studio all the time. For example, I've got lights around me. If I just wanted to measure the contribution of this one light right here, I'd point it and take my reading because I want to then measure the ratios of all my lights. So for that, I'll keep the lumisphere down. But generally, out in the field for landscapes, I'm going to keep that up all the time. Good question. Someone asked about how about just doing high dynamic range HDR stuff, doing exposures automatically in the camera, plus or minus 2 exposure values either way. We'll talk about that coming up in a little bit. Let's see. Someone asked, well, why do I need a separate meter? Can't I just use the spot meter in my camera and take the tonal range and place it in the proper zone? If you're that comfortable with doing your zone metering, then yeah, you actually can get away with doing that. The beauty of having a meter is, well, first of all, this is a 1-degree spot meter, so it's extremely accurate. And the zone system doesn't, in my opinion, does not completely apply to digital photography. It's a little bit different than when we were doing film and printing in the darkroom. Today's printers have a lot more tonal range than conventional stuff did in the past, and having a 1 degree spot meter is absolutely critical for us to be able to protect those highlights. It's really going to tell us what that highlight reading is at 1 degree, not at 5 degrees, which is going to extend out a little bit. But it's a good question, and most folks, by the way, are not, especially digital photographers nowadays, are not up on the zone features, so we'll talk about that. Let's see. Someone asked, can you use these metering techniques for film cameras? Absolutely. It's still the same thing. It's light. Now the difference is you don't need to protect the highlights on a film camera, especially if you're shooting negatives. We do with chromes, but not with negatives, because negatives just get denser with more light. Okay, let's see. A couple people asked some more features about the 758. This is not a 758 demonstration. I'll point you later on to some webinars I already did that go into a little more detail on the 758, but I am going to show you how to program it for filter compensation, so stay tuned. All right, let's continue on. Let's talk about shooting to the right, the whole concept in digital photography of getting your data towards the right. Why do you want to do that? Well, most of your data in your camera is captured on the right-hand side. You would think, let's say your camera has 5 stops, you would think that's evenly divided. It's not. Fully half of your data is captured in that top stop of light. So you want to make sure that you get your data as far to the right as possible without clipping. Now, my camera can safely capture around 2.5 stops up and down from any average meter reading for a minimum dynamic range of plus or minus 5 stops, or 5 stops total rather. I've measured my Canon 7D and found it to actually capture a bit more than 6 stops. So you might ask, how do I know this? Well, I measured my camera using the Sekonic DTS software in conjunction with a 758 DR meter. I'm not going to go into details today on how to do this, but you can find a video I did on the Sekonic website that goes through this process step by step. In fact, let me show you my computer screen again just for a second. Here's the Sekonic site. Go to Products and then to the 758 DR. And in the Overview tab, if you scroll down, you'll actually see my mug there with an introduction to the DTS or digital transfer software. And this goes over the details of how to do this. So let's take a look at the graph. This is the final graph that the DTS software created from my Canon 7D, and it plots out the entire tonal range of my camera. Now if we zoom in to the left-hand side, you might notice that the dynamic range of this particular camera lens combination is plus 2.8 and minus 3.5 stops from the middle reading. Now knowing this and using a safety margin of plus or minus 2.5 stops up and down from my middle reading is going to give me a lot of safety margin. So how can you put this knowledge to practical use? This is where spot metering comes in. Now keep in mind that whenever you take a meter measurement, that number is the average or middle of what you're reading. If we take a spot reading of a bright highlight, and you do that on a 758, actually looking through the 758 and taking a reading, when we take that spot reading of a highlight like a bright white cloud, the number you get back would actually put that bright reading in the tonal middle of the image. Well, we don't want that. We don't want that to be our middle tone. We want that close to white over on the right-hand side of that histogram. So taking a highlight reading and then opening up between 2 and 2.5 stops is going to put your bright highlights towards the right of the histogram without clipping them and completely blowing them out. For you zone folks, you're going to put it towards the edge of zone 8. Now, if there is no great abundance of bright white clouds, maybe the clouds are not a lot brighter than the sky. That happens frequently when it's hazy. You kind of have white clouds and a really bright white blue sky. Or if it's an overcast day, then I can just use one of my incident meters to simply take a reading of the ambient light illuminating the scene. I just need to make sure that I'm standing in the same light. And to bring up that question before, yes, if it is 12 noon or 1 o'clock and I've got the bright sun directly overhead, then I will put this right on the fringe of my shadow rather than doing it in the direct sun, which can influence that reading a bit. After I've got that reading, I just plug those numbers into my camera, which again is on full manual, and my exposures are perfect every time. Now, what if you want to use filters? How do you compensate for them? Simple. You actually just meter through them, take some sample readings. If you're using a circular polarizer, that's something I do all the time for landscape, Mine subtracts about 2 stops. By the way, if you really want to see the most power your circular polarizer is going to have, it actually is the most powerful at 90 degrees from the sun. So if you want to take a reading and you literally, if you want to see where it is, just hold up the filter and spin it and you'll see the sky change. Point at the sun and put your thumb out. And that thumb is going to show you 90 degrees from the sun. So if I've got the sun over there, then I know that I can look through the polarizer here and that's going to show me where the strongest point is. Let's say you're adding a neutral density filter. Same thing. Just take a meter reading through it. What if you're using both of them? Add them together, and we're going to see this put to use. So let's go back out in the field and see this concept in action.
So the gods of photography have smiled on us, and they've presented us with some really pretty clouds, which really brings up the idea of using a circular polarizer, because this will make the clouds really pop. Question I get often is, how do you meter when you're dealing with something like a polarizer, because it's going to change the exposure? It's actually really simple. So I've got a 758 here, I've got a dome in, and I'm going to take a meter reading of the light coming towards me, and I'm getting 400th of a second at f8. Well, with the polarizer, all I have to do is hold it in front of me, and I can spin it to see when it's at its densest, when it's at 100%, and just take a reading through it. And I get 100 at f8. Well, that was easy. 400th of a second to 100th of a second, exactly 2 stops. So all I have to do is take my meter and put a filter compensation factor of 2, and that's it. Now, what if I want to combine that with using the spot meter to find the reading in the cloud? So let's do that. So I'm going to switch to spot metering now. And I'm going to simply point at one of the brightest spots in the clouds. And I'm getting 1/1600th of a second at f8 on this really bright cloud up there. We were playing it safe earlier and just using a 2-stop difference from that highlight down. I've measured my camera, I'll show you that later. I know my camera can capture up 2.8 stops from the midtone, so I'm going to open up 2.5 stops from there. So I have my meter programmed to do that. This is a busy spot. Okay, so I have my ISO 2 button programmed to be a filter compensation factor. So if I hold an ISO 2, right now it's set for 2.5 stops. So that brings me from 1/1600th of a second down to 320. That's 2.5 stops open. Now I also need to open another 2 stops because of the polarizer. So I'm going to change my compensation from 2.5 to 4.5 stops. Now that's a lot to try to calculate in your head, but this is an exposure computer as well. It'll just easily do it for us. So when I dial in 4.5 stops compensation here, holding the ISO 2 button, I can see I go from 1/1600th of a second to 80th of a second at f8. So that's my perfect exposure, 2.5 stops open from the cloud highlights, plus another 2 stops open because of the polarizer. It's really that simple. So 80 at f8 at 160 ISO. Now if I decide I want a little more shutter speed, I can adjust my ISO because I don't want to open up my aperture anymore. So in fact, let's do that. And again, I don't have to figure it out. I can just change my ISO in the meter. I'm going to put it on 320, holding my ISO 2 button, and it tells me 1/60th of a second at f8. So let's do that. Actually, I'm going to keep my lens shade off so I can get my best exposure for the clouds. And remember, I changed my ISO to 320. Beautiful. We'll get to see the results in just a little bit.
So we've got some more questions again. First, for you zone system guys that are out there in this, apparently a couple of you. If you're not familiar with this book, then I highly recommend you get it. This book's by Lee Varys. It's actually called Mastering Exposure and the Zone System for Digital Photographers. Lee covers in detail how to place different parts of the image in the zone, in each zone, and explains it very well. So this is the book I recommend if you really want to get into the zone system with your digital photography. A couple other questions before we actually take a closer look at the 758. Someone asked, does this all work with the color checker? Absolutely. I didn't cover that today, but out in the field I use the color checker all the time. I usually carry a color checker passport with me everywhere I go. Here's a really good question. Someone asked, why do I need a meter if I'm using my histogram. Okay, well, you can use the histogram to a degree, but you have to understand that the histogram is telling you certain parts, but not everything. What is a correct histogram? It depends what the scene is, how much light, how much dark is in the scene. Also understand that the histogram that you're looking at on the back of your camera is a histogram of the JPEG that's generated using your in-camera settings to show that preview. It's not actually your raw data, so it's not completely accurate. Histograms are relative, and what I highly recommend you guys do is go on to Sakonic.com, and they've had some contests, and I believe the images are probably still up there, where you're asked to match the histogram to the image, and there's a bunch of them. And you'll be amazed how difficult it can be to try to decide what is a correct histogram for the scene in front of you. When you have a meter, it eliminates that. It really does. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked, does metering a gray card give you an accurate ambient light measurement as well? I assume you mean taking a reflective reading off a gray card. That can get you pretty close. It's just going to be dependent upon what is reflecting off of the gray card. Are there trees? Are there buildings? Are there other reflective surfaces? So it can be a little bit trickier, but yes, it will get you pretty close. Let's see. So somebody asked about the fringe. Oh, when I said about the fringe edge of the shadow, do I mean right by the start of it? Yes. I mean right before the shadow disappears and it goes into sun. Kind of that border area where it's just starting to be in shade to eliminate the direct sunlight, but it's still very bright and almost the same as the daylight. Good questions. All right, let's continue on. Filter compensation. I know everybody that has a 758, it drives you nuts. So let's actually do that. This is one thing I am going to show you. Now, when you get a 758, if you actually open the box in there, you might see there's a little sticker that comes with it. And these are actually all of the custom settings. Now, we're not going to concern ourselves with all of these. This is not a 758 demonstration. But we are going to cover compensation function. And it's really simple to do. What we need to do is go into the custom settings menu. So to do that, hold in the mode button and then power on the meter. And when I do that, you'll see on the upper right-hand side, it says CS. That stands for custom settings. And what we want to use is the jog wheel to get to custom setting number 1, which is what it's on right now. You can see as I spin the jog wheel, there is actually 17 of them. So I can go all the way through here, but I want to get back to number 1. So let me get back to 1. So you see there's a 0 next to that. You then press the mode button to cycle through the choices. Now for number 1, there's only one choice. It's either 0 or 1. As I hit the mode button, it cycles through the choices. What I want is custom setting 1 to be set for 1. What this does is it changes the ISO 2 button to filter compensation in 1/10 stops increments. So custom function 1 on 1, I then just turn the meter off. And when I turn it back on, that function is now activated. So now if I hold in the ISO 2 button, whoops, I didn't turn it off. Turn it off, turn it back on. Now if I hold in the ISO 2 button, which is right here, notice in the upper right-hand side, there are numbers there. And what I want to do is spin the jog wheel until those numbers say 2.5, not minus, but plus. So I spin around till I get to 2.5, and now you can see in the upper right-hand corner a 2.5 there. So let's say, for example, I wanted to just measure the lights here in the studio. I can take an ambient light meter reading, and I see that I get 1/30th of a second at F9. Well, what if I wanted to know 2.5 stops down for that? Let's make believe that was my highlight reading in a bright cloud, and I want to place this on the right-hand side. If I just push the ISO 2 button now, notice it changes from F9 to F3.6. So that's 2.5 stops open from that F9, and that would put that bright highlight right at the edge without blowing it out. So it's really as simple as that. And once you have that, you can continue to add. If you add another filter, so let's say I added a 2-stop neutral density filter over top of it, I would just change it back from 2.5, and I would change that to 4.5 stops. You zoomed in. All right, if you could just zoom out again, Ab. We're done with the meter. Okay. So, a couple of you asked about HDR imaging. When does HDR become necessary? Well, if the scene in front of you has more than 5 stops of tonal range, then you're going to have to consider HDR. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on HDR. It's a complete subject of its own that's going to take its own day. As a matter of fact, if you're interested in more information on HDR, there are 2 free on-demand webinars on Sekonic.com. In fact, let's see if I can bring them right up here on my computer. Let's take a look at my screen. If you go to Classroom and you take a look right here, it says on-demand webinars and seminars, and you'll see them. And if you scroll down, there we go. There are 2 right here, Part 1 and Part 2, HDR photography from realistic to fantastic. And it's about both capturing the images and processing them in various different softwares to make that happen. So let's go back into the field and explore the concept of shooting to the right a bit more. We're also going to combine this with compensating for a circular polarizer by using the meter. Let's take a look.
Really pretty scene here, a little bit difficult conditions. It just got really windy. We've got some beautiful clouds here. We've got the trestle bridge in the background. But let's get the exposure right. So first of all, I take an ambient reading. And remember, I'm at 320 ISO because we're going to be using a polarizer. F16, 400th of a second is the ambient reading. Now I want to take a spot reading also off the clouds. And I get 800 at F16, which actually isn't that bad. It's only 1 stop difference. So not going to be a problem for as far as HDR goes. So if I want to put, again, those clouds to the right, I'm going to open up 2 stops from my clouds, which would put me at 200 at F16. Now, I'm also going to add the polarizer, which adds another 2 stops. So 2 stops from 200, 100 is 1 stop, 50 would be 2 stops. So we're going to go 50th of a second at F16, and let's see what we get. 50th at F16, and take my shot. By the way, never judge your exposure by this thing, but you can kind of at least take a look. And from the what I'm seeing on the viewfinder, it looks gorgeous. So you see we have all these filter factors to deal with. We're opening up 2 stops from the bright clouds. We're opening up 2 stops because of the polarizer. Can be a lot to keep track of. That's the beauty of having a meter like the 758. Now, if this is not an option for you, then you can certainly use your spot meter in your camera. You just have to learn a little bit about f-stops. How can you open up 4 stops from that? So what is 4 stops? Well, we're dealing with ISO 320 in order to give us a little bit of range. If I wanted to go even higher, let me do 640. So if I do 640 off the clouds, I get 1600th of a second at f16. So what's 4 stops from that? Well, 1 stop will be 800, 2 stops is 400, 3 stops is 200, 4 stops will be 100. So 100th of a second at f16 is 4 stops opened up from that 1/1600th of a second. Math isn't too bad if you stick in the even numbers. It's when you get in the middle it gets a little hairy. So that's the beauty of this, but if you learn about f-stops, you can get around this as well. Just doesn't work early in the morning before you had your coffee. So I'm going to take a couple more shots and I'm going to move over to a different spot. Came across a really cool scene, plus we got Jen to be in the frame, so she's going to just add a little bit of interest up on the top of that little path there. So again, I'm using the circular polarizer, and I want to compensate for the clouds. So the clouds are bright white, but they're not extremely different than the ambient light. So what I'm going to do is take my meter reading off the clouds, which is 1200, I'm at 640 ISO now. That's 1250th of a second at f16. I'm going to come down 2 stops from that, and 2 stops for my circular polarizer. So that's -4, I'm gonna open up 4, and I just hit the button on here with my compensation set to 4, and it comes back with 80th of a second at 16. That's it, it's really that simple. So I just go to 80th, and it allows me to concentrate now on the actual composition. And that is really cool. So what I've done is I want to make sure, I'm making sure that the horizon is on the lower third. Your viewfinder generally has a grid in it. Keep your horizon either at the lower third or at the upper third, not kind of in the middle. I'm going to frame a little differently. I'm going to put Jen right on the lower left strong intersection point in the rule of thirds. So that you kind of got the bridge leading down right to her. So it's kind of a diagonal pointing to her. So once you get all this exposure stuff taken care of, and you don't have to worry about the camera fooling around, then you can concentrate on this kind of stuff, and that's what's going to give you great images. Got it. Very cool. That's great. Love it. It's going to be cool.
All right, so before we continue, some good questions again. So someone asked, why do I meter with the dome down when I was going through the filter compensation? And the reason for that was I just wanted to measure the light coming through the filter. I didn't want any extraneous light coming through. So in that case, I did actually put the dome down just so I could have the filter fairly close to the meter as I did my rotation. Someone asked, how do you spot meter for clouds if you don't have a spot meter on your meter? Like if you have one of these two, and I frequently use these. I've got a 358 here and a 308S here. So how do you do that? In that case, if I need to spot meter off the clouds, I'll actually use the camera spot meter. I'll take an ambient reading with my meter, say like here, like the 308. I'll take my ambient reading, and let's, for example, say it's, just to throw some numbers at it, at 200 ISO I get F8. Well, if I take a spot meter with my camera and I see it is more than 2.5 stops higher than that, then I have to adjust for it. Now, this does require that you learn a little bit about f-stops and what 2.5 stops more means. So, for example, if I meter off the clouds and I get at ISO 200, at whatever my shutter speed is, I'm getting f16, what would 2.5 stops down from x16 be? Well, if I'm going to do apertures, f16 to f11 would be 1 stop, f11 to f8 would be 2 stops. Now my camera's set in thirds, so if I wanted to play safe and come down another third stop, it's going to be 7.1. Shutter speeds are a little easier. If I'm at f8 and it's 1,000th of a second on my bright spot, 2.5 stops down would be, well, 500th of a second would be 1 stop, 250 would be 2 stops, and then around 160 would be 2.5 stops. So you can see why the meter makes it easier. But you can also figure it out if you just follow how f-stops work. A couple of you have questions that are very specific about certain meters, including some that have been discontinued. What I'm going to offer is, when we're done, we will send a follow-up email to everybody, and there'll be a way to ask us questions. If you would please send me those questions again, I will forward them to the technical folks who can get you real specific answers to very specific meter questions. Someone asked, does the polarizer always eat 2 stops? No, it does not. My polarizer at full power does take 2 stops. As you rotate it, it does take less. In most cases, I'll take a look through the filter and see, do I need the full? I can take readings in between. I'll take one at full power and one with it rotated in the other direction 90 degrees to have it at its practically turned off, and I'll see what that difference is. And let's say, for example, it's 2 stops at full power and 1 stop halfway. I can adjust for that accordingly. If I know I'm going to back off halfway, then I'll maybe do 1.5 stops. But again, very good question. Some of this takes a little bit of experience, just learning to see how your equipment works. I do know that I was shooting at full power because there weren't, in most cases, a lot of clouds that I really needed to bring out. It was a little more subtle, so I wanted to use it at full power to really bring that out. Someone said they had always heard that you point the dome towards the camera. That applies to something you can actually stand next to. If I'm taking a picture of a model or something that's a couple feet away and I can walk to, then yes, then I will just come over with my meter, and I'll do it off the back of my computer. If I wanted a reading here, yes, I would do that. In the cases where I'm shooting a bridge that's a mile away, it doesn't mean I'm not going to walk a mile away through the river to get to the bridge. So in that case, I'll just take my reading close by. A couple of you are asking questions about portraits, and you're in luck. Our next webinar is going to be about doing that kind of metering for portraits. And someone else asked about using a reflector. Does that change the way you meter as well? Yes, and we will cover that in the next section. So if you don't have a spot meter and you want to do that cloud kind of reading, then you're going to have to rely on your camera. It's not going to be quite as sensitive, so give yourself a little more wiggle room. Maybe instead of 2.5 stops, just work on 2 stops. And again, if you're getting 1,000th of a second at f8 on the cloud, bring it down 2 stops, 500th is 1, 250th is 2 stops. And it's really that simple to do. So let's see, a couple more questions. Is there anything else going on here? Let's see. Oh, someone mentioned that they do have a spot meter for their 358. Why didn't I mention it? Yes, there is a spot meter attachment for the 358. If you already own a 358, that's an option. You can get one for it. If you really like the spot metering and you're debating between these two, well, with the price difference, this plus a spot meter is very close to that of a 758, and this has a lot more calculation functions that can really make things easy, including figuring out HDR work. So if you really want spot meter and you haven't yet got a meter, then just get the 758. If you already have one of these, yes, you can purchase a spot meter attachment for it. Let's see. Okay, let's continue on. Let's talk a little bit about software. Now, for landscape enhancements, I'll frequently do some fairly involved edits, some very basic, some very extreme. You might ask, well, if you did everything right, then why do I even need to edit in the first place? It's a valid question, but very simply answered. Most landscapes can use some help in directing the viewer through the scene. And think back to Ansel Adams. I actually saw a gallery show where you saw some images printed straight from the negative, and then after he did his work in the darkroom. We're doing that today with Photoshop and Lightroom. You can't control the light in a landscape. I will frequently gently shape the light to subtly add direction to the image, just as was done in the darkroom by the great printers. They would burn and dodge to direct you to the point of view in the image they wanted you to see. This directs the viewer to the features that are important to you that explain the story. Now, demonstrating a landscape editing techniques is actually a subject for another day or even days. And actually those days are already scheduled and they're coming up later in the month, so we'll send you links to that a little bit later. Until then, let's take a look at a few examples showing the type of light shaping that I typically do of before and after. So let's bring up that little show and I'll just talk over it. Now, sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes I'll go extreme. So here we have a scene, we're going to see this location in just a minute, and I'll just add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation to just add a little more oomph to the image. Same thing here, light is very good, exposure is good, but I want to bring out some of the fine detail, darken the sky a little further. Now next, again, a similar scene we saw from our rule of thirds. I wanted to bring out the skies even a little more. What I actually did was use a polarizing filter in Photoshop to make this happen. Sometimes I'll go extreme. Sometimes I'll look at a scene and think, well, it's in color, but I'm seeing it some other way. And this was actually done with Nick's Silver Effects plugin, actually directly from Photoshop. Same thing here. I saw this scene and I thought black and white when I captured it because the sky was so dramatic. Again, Nick's Silver Effects. And often also a scene does not record the way your eye sees it. Your eye has a different tonal range than your camera does. So I want to bring back the scene the way I remembered it, and that's what happened there. Even with a polarizer, sometimes it won't cut through haze in great distances. So I will use software to clear up that haze. And then sometimes I'll go completely nuts and see a scene that I just think needs some more elements, and I will go ahead and replace the sky. Because again, I'm after creating a mood in a photograph, not recording a scene for posterity. Same thing, subtle change, but this is the scene more how my eyes saw it, where it came out of the camera a little bit flat. So before we finish up for the day, let's take one more trip. This time we're going to go to the top of Bear Mountain. While we're up there, I'm going to sum up some of the advantages of using these meters to improve your landscape photography. So we'll be right back.
All right, so we have a meter geek out here. I've got all 3 meters, and we're up on the top of Bear Mountain. It's a really gorgeous day, a little breezy, but it's nice. Now you can see it's a little bit hazy. We do have a little bit of clouds in the sky, so I definitely want to use the circular polarizer. I'm going to use it at full strength because that's going to really bring out the white clouds against the blue sky. So I want to check first my ambient reading here. because the white clouds really aren't enough really to factor in as far as exposure goes. Most of the sky is blue with a little bit of white in it, and the white clouds are not super bright. So I'm just going to rely on my ambient reading, and just from experience I know that those clouds are not more than 2.5 stops brighter than the ambient. So I take my reading. Again, I'm at 320 ISO because I have the polarizer, so it's going to cost me a couple of stops. So I take my reading and I get 3/20th of a second at f/18. Just to compare, 758. 3/20th of a second at f/18. And my little Sekonic 308, same thing. Take my reading, 3/20th of a second at f/18. So they all agree, that's good. So I got 3/20th at f/18. Well, I can let the 758 do all the work, and I can just hit in my ISO 2 button and have my exposure compensation set for 2 stops. And when I do that, I see it drops me down from 320 to, it's bouncing back and forth a little between 80th and 100th of a second. So that's my 2 stops open because of the polarizer. Now I can, if I want to keep my f/16, which I do, because there's a nice little bench up here, and I've got this tree, and I want to use those as foreground elements, so I want to have the foreground and the background in focus. Actually, I'm going to recruit Jen. Jen, would you be our model again? So again, 320 at f/18. I just put that in here. And actually, if I decide I want to adjust my f-stop, I can do that as well. So let's see, at f/14, yeah, f/14 makes it easy. At f/14, it's 100th of a second. And that's including 2 stops open because of the circular polarizer. So I just put those numbers in the camera, f/14 at 100th, and I get a gorgeous shot. It really is that easy. Now, if you don't have a 758 and you want to do that 2-stop open thing. So if I adjust my metering, and I'm going to go to 400th of a second just to make the f-stop piece easy. So at 400th of a second, I take my reading and I'm at f/16. Now it's easy to figure out 2 stops from 400th. Because remember, we're leaving the aperture alone, we're just adjusting the shutter speed. So 400 to 200 is one stop, 200 to 100th of a second is 2 stops, that easy. Now, as I look through the viewfinder, the camera is on evaluative metering. Since it is pointing at that big deep green down at the bottom, the camera thinks it's about a stop and a third underexposed. So if we went with the camera's exposure, this would end up being overexposed a lot. So again, that's the beauty of these things. It doesn't take into effect the color of the thing you're shooting. So just to have an example, I'm going to let the camera do the metering and we'll see what happens. And yeah, you'll see it's kind of blown it out. So that's why you can't trust the camera's meter for this landscape kind of photography. Trust these. This will make your photography so much easier. You're going to have a perfect exposure, and you're going to be able to concentrate on your composition. Yeah, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to change my point of view. That's going to give a little different mood to the image. And also, I am using a tripod. Important because, remember, we're down to 80th to 100th of a second. You're getting a little dicey there about his hand holding, so I want to have a really rock steady shot so that I know everything's nice and sharp. So let's see what things look like from down here. Oh yeah, it's a very different point of view. I like it.
All right, so we've got a couple more questions. We're just about out of time, but there's a couple questions I do want to answer. First of all, now, somebody asked me to please discuss using the meters with video using a 7D. I don't have time to do that today. I apologize. However, that webinar is coming up also. In fact, what I'm going to use is a new meter, which is a version of the 308 called the 308 DC. And it's actually specifically designed, it does regular metering, but it also has all the functions that you video folks would like. Frame rate and shutter angle and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned. That's a different subject, but I will talk about it in an upcoming webinar that I'm working on right now. Let's see. Someone asked, can you use the type of ambient spot meter that we used in the film days? Absolutely. The light is still the same. You're still going to have the same kind of readings, so by all means go ahead and use it. Someone asked what kind of tripod with those handles that I was using on the windy day. That's an Enduro CT214. It's a carbon fiber tripod with a PHQ3 panoramic head. It's a nice heavy head, and that combination with the camera is a very stable system, and I can highly recommend it. So again, somebody else asked about using Sekonic meters with video functions, and both the 308 DC and the 750, there's a 758 version called the Cine that does that as well. So take a look again on Sekonic.com and you can find information about that. As far as recommending a meter, it all depends on your needs. If you're looking for a good, consistent ambient light meter that will also handle flash, then I love the 308S. It's a great little meter. If you're in studio work and you're using Pocket Wizards, I like the 358 because it has the ability to put a Pocket Wizard transmitter in the back of it, and I can actually fire and measure my lights without having to actually go over to it. So I will use the 358 for that. If you really want to get into HDR, you're a serious landscape photographer, you want to have the meter do all those calculations for you, that's where the 758 comes in. So it really comes down to, well, your budget, and two, what kind of photography do you want to do. This is the Rolls-Royce. It will do everything that you can possibly imagine, but if you don't need all the features, you can take a look at one of the other two as well. Let's see, anything else before we get things closed down here? I think we're just about at the end. Okay. Somebody asked about white balance. Yes, I typically use the Color Checker Passport for my white balance, subject again for another day. So let's sum up what we've discussed today. What are the lessons to be learned? Well, the process might be summed up as observe, measure, compose, shoot, and enhance. First of all, stop and think about why you are capturing the scene or subject in front of you. What are you trying to convey? What emotion, story, or impression do you want the viewer to experience? Second, measure the light that is important to the composition. If HDR is not an option for this particular scene, make sure that the primary subject is being exposed correctly, and be careful about clipping those highlights, because that's really important. You got to make sure you protect those highlights in a landscape image. Next, be aware of composition. Where are the horizon lines falling? Are there any distracting elements in the background or in the foreground that are going to detract from the image? Have you made it clear what the subject is? Are you directing the viewer correctly to show what it is that you want to share with them? And is it clear why the photograph was taken? What are you trying to convey to the viewer? To me, the absolute best landscape image is one that the viewer comes in, they can feel what you felt, whether it be the sun or the wind or the sounds, maybe even the smells, and they want to linger. They'll go right to your subject, but then maybe they'll look around a little bit and then come back to your subject. When that happens, then I think you've hit a home run on your landscape image. Now, if you get all this right in camera to the best of your ability, it's going to mean a lot less time in front of the computer. The time you do spend in front of the computer will be there to enhance and perfect selected images, not an attempt to rescue problem files. Now, once again, we spent a lot of time on the subject of getting it right in camera, yet there's still a lot more to talk about. In the coming months, we're going to explore in detail more subjects, including one, using fill flash and ambient light. A lot of folks have asked me about that. It drives them nuts. They're out in the bright sun. They need to add some flash, but they want it to look natural just to fill in shadows. That's actually going to be coming up shortly. Location and environmental portraiture, using lights and reflectors and how to meter for that and make the person belong in the scene. Bridal portraiture, making a comeback, something you can use to add to your bottom line. We'll explore lighting and posing and environment for doing bridal portraits. A couple of you asked about video. That's going to be coming up also. We're going to be talking about metering for video and actually producing a video that can be used for a commercial setting. That's something you can also add to your business offering. And then lastly, we'll talk about setting up a portrait studio with effective lighting, whether it be everything from basic speed lights to continuous lights to studio strobes. As always, I welcome your suggestions and questions. Thank you for all your great questions today. I would love to hear about the subjects you'd like to learn more about. Also, if you'd like the ultimate and hands-on training, join me on a location workshop. You can check out my website for what's coming up. I'll leave you today with a short slideshow of some of the images that we took during our days shooting around Bear Mountain. So until next time, keep shooting, because you know what? It's almost a sure bet that you haven't yet taken your best photograph. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.